right now.
Well, the main message that we hear from Crimea's officials, and now, sorry, I have to interrupt myself because there is a cortege of obviously pro-Russian demonstrators. And you can see and you can understand what is the message that they're sending now. So this is the mood here on the peninsula, while the entire country is divided into those who are supporting the country's new authorities and those who don't recognize them as legitimate power. Here in the Crimea, the mood is quite unanimous. People support Russia and Russia's recent decisions, and they don't want to be with Kiev's new masters. And talking about security and safety here in the region, and a very important question, what will be going on with the Ukrainian military stationed here on the peninsula? Crimea's officials are saying that they are either leaving their posts and the military forces and leaving their arsenals, or, and as we understand this is in the majority of the cases, they are siding with Crimea's authorities. This is what Crimea's prime minister has to say about that.
All of the patriotic soldiers cooperate with us. The vast majority of military units and law enforcement agencies have sided with the people and the Crimean autonomy. We warn all of the hotheads who want to resist using firearms that they will be dealt with according to the law.
The main message that we hear from Crimea's officials is that the situation is under their control and there is no any reason for any panic. And they say that the security is now provided mostly by so-called self-defense squads made up of locals who are working in coordination with police. We see these people here and there. They don't wear any specific uniforms. They're just patrolling the streets of major cities here in the Crimea, not necessarily strategic or governmental buildings, but just ordinary streets, day and night. We're also hearing reports that 2 vessels of Ukraine's Black Sea Fleet left earlier today the port of Sevastopol, which is just 100 kilometers away from where we are now, but later they returned because of some damages. It's a very complicated situation here in the country, and of course it's not easy to say exactly what happened with these vessels, so we have to wait and see what will be going on.
Let's now turn to Auntie's Alexei Yarosh, who is in the city of Kharkov in the east of the country right now. So, Alexei, how noticeable is the anti-government sentiment where you are right now, and how is it being expressed?
Well, certainly the division in the country which Maria was talking about was very easily tangible here on Saturday, when the pro-Russian activists and those who are not supporting the new authorities in Kiev clashed with the so-called activists of the Euromaidan who were securing the local administration. They managed to get inside the administration and put a Russian flag on top of it. There have been reports of tear gas used and scores of injured. The official line here in Kharkov that more than 100 people were brought to hospitals with different sorts of injuries. Rocks were flying, sticks and batons were used against each other. So it was pretty violent here. Pretty much the same story has been happening, well, maybe not as violent as in Kharkov, but along the same line was happening in many other cities in the east of Ukraine, in the city of Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, Lugansk, and many other cities. In Donetsk, for instance, this is also one of the largest cities, the industrial center of Ukraine. The people voted not to trust the authorities in Kiev, and they even called on a referendum to be held in the nearest future to decide the future of the whole region. Right now it's pretty much quiet, but I've just listened to one of the activists of the Euromaidan talking in Kiev from the stage that Ukrainian flags must be reinstated on all governmental buildings and all local administration buildings in the east of the country. Where this all might go, nobody knows. It's pretty much a powder keg, and we are certainly do not know what to expect in the nearest future here in the east of the country.
And RT asked the organizer of an anti-government rally in the southeastern city of Dnipropetrovsk what's driving the protests.
10,000 people have gathered in Dnipropetrovsk, for we shall never take away the power. Our cultural differences in this country generally imply that we need protection. The Nazis have frightened the police all around the country. They catch them, they kill them, and the police now is has just lost its morale. And the only way for us is to claim protection. And we have gathered today all around the eastern Ukraine on numerous meetings. Both these groups, us and these pro-Western liberals, can go to the election. But first, we need to have the order restored. Before the election, we need to have the order restored.
Also, thousands have marched through central Moscow in a show of support for Ukrainians. Students, veterans and politicians gathered to call for an end to the spread of extremism and fascism across Ukraine and a return to national unity. They also voiced their support for those in Crimea with Russian passports who are unwilling to leave their homes despite the potential threat to their lives. Activists urged a peaceful solution to the crisis. Russia did agree the potential deployment of its military to keep the peace in Crimea following a plea from local authorities after key government buildings were attacked. More on that with Daria Peshkova.
The situation is very serious and even dangerous in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. More than half of its population is ethnic Russians, and they're forced to ward off attacks from radical groups that came to power in Kiev as a result of last week's coup. Now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has addressed the parliament asking for support of potential military help. Let's now listen to what he's had to say.
Because of the extraordinary situation in Ukraine, which represents a threat to the lives of Russian citizens, our compatriots and the contingent of Russian armed forces located in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, according to an international treaty, as stated in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, I ask the Upper House of Parliament for permission to use armed forces in Ukraine until the situation there is stabilised.
The Federation Council unanimously approved the move. It was specifically reiterated by both the senators and the presidential spokesman that the deployment was optional depending on the severity of the threat to the Russian nationals living in the Crimea and southeast territories of Ukraine. It simply gives the Russian president the right to react promptly in case of infiltration of radical groups into those territories. If there are attacks of nationalistic radicals on ethnic Russians, or if assaults continue similar to the ones that took place on the 1st of March in the Crimea's capital, Simferopol.
To understand why Crimea refuses to recognize the new regime in Kiev and why it has appealed to Russia for help, go to our website, rt.com. You'll find the historical background to how the peninsula was separated from Russia and why the majority of locals want a back in. So do go to rt.com for full analysis. Members from the disbanded Ukrainian riot police unit Berkut have started receiving Russian passports at the Russian consulate in Crimea. Earlier this week, Russia offered citizenship and career opportunities to ex-officers. 16 Berkut servicemen were killed during weeks of anti-government protests in Ukraine's capital. The opposition accused the riot police of abusing and killing protesters during the unrest in Kiev. But in other parts of the country, including Crimea, they have been met by cheering crowds. Talk of Russia sending troops has led to a sharp international response. President Obama said Moscow was breaching international law and could end up isolated. Canada joined in by condemning Putin's military intervention. Both of them, plus Britain and France, have decided to suspend preparations for the G8 summit in Sochi. The EU's foreign policy chief weighed in, deploring Russia's potential use of force. And Sweden's Prime Minister went even further, saying Moscow's masterminding a pro-Russian puppet semi-state in Crimea. And his British colleague says there's no excuse for outside military intervention. All this despite Moscow still not having decided whether to send troops. Gayatri Chechen reports.
What Russia brings to the UN is the message that those who, through force, took power in Kiev should not count on using force against people in Crimea and other parts of Ukraine that had no say in the power grab at Maidan. The Russian envoy to the UN called on Kiev and those who have influence on Kiev to bring the situation in the country on a, quote, political, constitutional track. Russia urges everyone to go back to the agreement signed in February between the Ukrainian government and some of the opposition leaders that would lead to elections, that would lead to a unity government which would be inclusive and would not trample on the interests of a big part of Ukraine that had no say in the power grab at Maidan. In the meantime, Russia calls for decision makers in Kiev and in the West to rein in, as the ambassador said, the radicals in Ukraine who have very anti-Russian sentiments and who present danger to the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. Russia says if the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine is in danger, it will take measures to protect them under international law. Earlier, the Russian parliament suggested that the Russian president recall the ambassador to the U.S. for consultations. We don't know whether or not the Russian president will actually do that, but Russian lawmakers say this proposal was in reaction to President Obama saying Russia would pay if it intervened in Ukraine.
And we spoke to world affairs historian Professor Mark Armand from Oxford University. He believes Western politicians are starting to understand the force that has been unleashed in Ukraine thanks to this coup.
Suddenly, the Western media and the Western governments that had been very enthusiastic about what they call people power, who had turned a blind eye to the paramilitary and neo-Nazi elements on the streets of Kiev, have begun to back away. Now the Western sponsors are rather worried. Suddenly we begin to see criticism of the new regime in Kiev's abolition of Russian language rights, of its rescinding of the ban on neo-Nazi symbols, and so on. Suddenly the West begins to say perhaps we've unleashed a force here that is, in fact, highly destabilizing. They've realized, in fact, that the coup that overthrew Yanukovych has, in fact, not been the end of the drama, but only the first act. And, of course, it's a sign, I think, of a rather childish, almost unbelievably incompetent attitude on the part of the NATO countries, that they facilitated this crisis without thinking through what would happen, that you are unleashing forces of nationalism, of fear, that can become uncontrollable.
While Crimean authorities were asking Moscow for help, the leader of Ukrainian nationalist group Right Sector has reached out for help to one of the world's most notorious terrorists. On a social network, he asked Doku Umarov to step up attacks against Russia. Doku Umarov is the leader of the Chechen Islamist movement and an international terrorist, basically Russia's Osama bin Laden. He was the mastermind of several deadly attacks on civilians in Russia, including the bombings of Moscow's Domodedovo airport and metro system, which took the lives of hundreds of people. Doku Umarov wants to create an Islamic state in southern Russia ruled by Sharia law. Russia's foreign ministry responded to the appeal to the Chechen militant by pointing out the radical nature of many of those now in power in Ukraine. The leader of the Ukrainian Nationalist claimed his page, where the message was posted, had been hacked. And earlier we spoke to journalist Neil Clark, who says that such an appeal would be in line with the anti-Russian attitude of right-wing groups in Ukraine.
If we think back to the 1990s, Yulia, we had a lot of Ukrainian hardcore neo-Nazis travelling out to Chechnya to fight in the so-called war for separatism from Russia. So there's always been this link for the last 20 years or so between the most sort of hard-right extremist factions in Ukraine and the Islamist cause in Chechnya, the radical Islamist cause. So this is an alliance that goes back quite a long way, really. And of course, there's a third strand to this alliance, which is the neoconservatives in the West. What unites the neoconservatives in the West with Ukrainian neo-Nazis and radical Islamists in Chechnya is, of course, their hatred for Russia. They will do anything, however extreme, to get at Russia. And so I think this Ukrainian crisis is sort of reminding us once again this sort of axis of evil that's ranged against Russia that combines neoconservatives in Washington and in Britain and in France and elsewhere with radical neo-Nazis in the Ukraine and radical Islamists in Chechnya. This really is a kind of alliance that is targeting Russia. And this is just a reminder, really.
At the same time, the Right Sector group denies appealing to Umarov, saying its website was hacked. Is that some kind of damage control now, then?
Oh, absolutely. I think that this has become rather embarrassing for the West, really, because the fact is that they've used the far right to get their people in power in Kiev. And now these sort of statements are coming out. Now the extremism is there for everybody to see. They're in complete denial. And I think that the Right Sector is trying to sort of back down from this now, but it's all there. I mean, we know that they've got they've had links with Chechen radicals. We know that they are a radical far-right neo-Nazi group, and now they're trying to sort of say that it wasn't them and the website was hacked. It doesn't wash, I'm afraid. I think we know this extremism is there. It's there for everybody to see. And this anti-Russian obsession from the Western elites is costing us all dear. It's very dangerous. It could provoke, who knows, war perhaps And until the Western elites drop this, and drop this anti-Russian obsession, this neoconservative influenced obsession with Russia and demonizing Russia, then I'm afraid we're only going to get more chaos in the next few weeks and months.
And apparently it's not just the notorious Chechen terrorists that the nationalists in Ukraine have appealed for help to. Russian border guards have detained an activist who took part in riots in the Ukrainian capital, and he claims there were many foreigners fighting on Kiev streets.
There were many foreigners at Maidan. I can even give you rough numbers. There were about 60 Americans who are still there. There were also Germans, 30 to 40 of them. Poles and Turks too, although I'm not sure how many. But the Americans were by far the most active. There were also misfits from all over Ukraine. People without jobs, without education. They came because they knew there was anarchy. You can do anything and no one can stop you. There were drugs, alcohol, violence. It attracted them.
We'll return after a short break with more news for you.